Please welcome moderator BSA's Matteo Quattrocchi and panelists David Livingston of the U.S. Department of State and Eric Loeb of Salesforce.
All right, hello everybody. It's going to be an interesting panel for us to feed you interesting information as you're eating. Well, first of all, thank to the panelists. Thank you for being here today. Let's dive right in. So, as you know, BSA represents enterprise software companies, and we feel very strongly about sustainability. We feel very strongly about the role that software companies and generally the private sector can have in enhancing sustainability. As a matter of fact, BSA, with its members, published last fall a set of global sustainability principles to essentially showcase what our companies are doing to become more sustainable, and at the same time what they're doing to help others, organizations, governments, companies, citizens, communities, to become more sustainable themselves. And today's panel is a really good opportunity to go into that. So I want to start with David and ask really what are the administration's ambitions, objectives in the space, and yeah, let's hear from you.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to BSA for having me and for hosting this important discussion. I know we don't have a ton of time, so I'll jump right into it, even though I'm distracted by the incredible sort of alien overlord above us.
True.
I am proud to say that 2 years in now plus to this administration, our office, working with many other partners across government, so not just our office, but other parts of the US government, the White House, the State Department, Department of Energy, Department of Commerce, USAID, and many others, have stood up a unique set of architectures that have never existed at the scale or with the diversity or scope before, that are architectures which draw in the private sector to help us be problem solvers for some of our most vexing sustainability challenges, some of our most vexing challenges, both on the climate mitigation and the climate adaptation side. I'll give you an example of a few of those, and a few of those which I think will be most relevant on the road to COP28, which is taking place in Dubai at the end of this year, in December of this year. COP28 is going to be a very important COP for several reasons. It is, first and foremost, the first year after the Paris Agreement was agreed to, which will have something called the global stocktake. This is essentially a pulse check of where we are on our goals, where we're off track, and to identify what the nature and texture of those gaps are so that we can best tailor the tools needed to address those gaps. Now, I don't think we need to wait for the formal outcome of the UN global stocktake to tell you that we're not on track. I am pleased to say that I think many of these architectures to draw in the private sector and to work on public-private collaboration are going to be well suited to address some of the gaps we have. So let me identify some of those. The first one I'll mention is frankly going on just down the street from us, and it's where I'll be heading after this event later this afternoon, and that is something called the Agriculture Innovation Mission for Climate, AIM for Climate, or AIM for C for short. This was something that we established with the UAE as a founding partner back in 2021. We previewed it and began discussing it at President Biden's Earth Day Summit, which took place in April 2021. And in 2 years' time, we have now stood up an initiative which has mobilized $13 billion worth of climate-smart agriculture innovation investment commitments by governments, $10 billion by governments, $3 billion by the private sector, in terms of new spending versus a 2020 baseline in climate-smart ag innovation. Now, this runs the gamut across adaptation and mitigation. It covers everything from more drought-resistant crops to electrified tractors and farm equipment, the integration of photovoltaic PV systems into farms for not only off-grid power for agricultural activities, but also smart shading. It covers new low-carbon fertilizers. It covers new uses of artificial intelligence and machine learning to help us better predict weather patterns and have our farmers more equipped to a changing climate. One of the things I'm most excited about in Agriculture Innovation Mission for Climate is something that we call an innovation sprint that we've oriented around the application of AI/ML to some of our climate smart ag challenges. So this is bringing in basically some of the most talented folks from across this sector, from across the software, tech, and IT sector to work on AI/ML applications, including things like better understanding changes or divergences in the vibration of bees, the vibration of bee activity as they're doing pollination, to understand actually changing weather patterns and other changing dynamics and inputs into agricultural activity, drawing all sorts of connections and dots or lines between dots that we previously were unable to sort of connect. So that's one thing that really excites me. Again, we've got more than 500 partners engaged in this, more than 50 governments, 450 non-government partners, all working to mobilize more investment as a foundation for climate smart agriculture investment, and innovation investment, but also working on actual concrete collaborations. Those are our innovation sprints, where we bring in public sector players, private sector players to work on these specific innovations that need to be commercialized and scaled up over the coming years. The other thing that we work on, that Eric knows well because of Salesforce's role and many other companies' role, is the First Movers Coalition. This is essentially a buyer's club, a demand signaling exercise that takes some of the largest corporations in the world, gets them to signal that there will be a market for low carbon industrial goods and low carbon transportation fuels and services in the year 2030 onwards. And that demand signal, those companies saying, I will buy X amount of green steel, green cement, green shipping fuel, green aviation fuel in the year 2030 onwards, that provides the certainty that's needed to get investment flowing, to lower the cost of capital, and to get those projects with shovels in the ground and FIDs made this year, next year, so that those projects are ready by the end of this decade. It's trying to move up by a scale of 5 to 10 years the sorts of hard to abate industrial sector supply and transportation sector supply of green goods, near zero emissions goods and services that would otherwise take, again, 5 to 10 years longer. So we're very excited about that as well. We now have 80 companies that have made 100 demand side commitments, representing $12 billion of collective demand signal. And those 80 companies cover about $9 trillion worth of collective global market cap. So it's a sizable demand signal in the market. And what we're hoping to do is to now follow that up with governments making similar demand signals using their public procurement capabilities. And again, taking the demand signal, matching them with supply, and marrying that wherever possible with the sort of incentives that are available through things like the Inflation Reduction Act, so that we get real projects financed and we help people to move ahead on their sustainability goals. And then the final thing I'll just mention is we also recognize that there's a need for credible, high credibility, high integrity offsets to help companies deal with the emissions that are the trickiest to deal with, that they can't deal with in the years ahead just by trying to make investments in their own value chains. And so here we're working on something called the Energy Transition Accelerator, the ETA, which is a novel, innovative jurisdictional carbon crediting mechanism, which is meant to reward companies for making investments that drive forward and catalyze clean energy transitions in the power sectors of key emerging economies. So it's meant to crowd in capital to places like Indonesia or other emerging economies to help to tip their energy sector transitions away from carbon intensive like coal into clean energy economy faster and at scale, and rewarding those companies by making credible additional investments that would otherwise not have been made into those power sector opportunities. So stay tuned for more on that as well over the course of this year on the road to COP28 in Dubai. I'll just underscore, we couldn't do it without many of the leaders in this room. We couldn't do it without many of the leaders and those who are working with us, who are watching this, perhaps live stream or recorded. And our doors are open, our inboxes are open, and our minds are open to what more we can do this year so that we make COP28 a transformational COP, and so that we continue to run through the tape and get the job done with what we've started together over the course of these past 2 years.
Thank you. It is a lot to think about, and I think let's put it from our perspective, the enterprise software perspective, and Salesforce specifically. What are we doing? How are we helping this? What's our mission here, and how do we move forward and help it as much as possible?
Great. Well, from a starting point, I want to thank you for all you're doing. And just for everybody to understand, as you heard, there is so much that your office is doing, and the energy that you're putting in, that Secretary Kerry is putting in, they are everywhere. And not only with all of the initiatives to engage the private sector and other stakeholders, but of course all the multilateral work, all the bilateral negotiations, and so just grateful for the energy and the intensity, because it has been a sprint that's been going on for a couple of years. So congratulations on your endurance. The next thing I'd say is this is so exciting for all of us in BSA. As a sector, not only does enterprise software have an amazing amount that we all are doing within our organizations, but what we can do to help all of our customers, all of whom have much more that they can do and much more that they want to do, and increasingly much more that they need to do. And I can come back and talk later about the role that data comes into transparency, accountability, and change. But I'll just come back to some of the points that David was highlighting about the different roles that different stakeholders have here. When I think back, whether it's the road to COP28 or we think of COP27 or the biodiversity conference, there's a critical role, of course, at the multilateral level for policy setting. And at the same time, while it's critical, it also takes a long time. There are a lot of parties involved, so sometimes that consensus process is not as ambitious or as fast as one might hope. But that pairs up then with what the private sector can do and with the type of initiatives for partnership that David just described. We all can come in with speed, we can come in with innovation, we can come in with investment. And so bringing these edges together towards something where I think all agree we are in this together, we must be. And from a business imperative standpoint, more and more and more you hear people say, all right, well, why is this a business imperative? Well, if I don't have a planet, I don't have a business. So that's a decent motivator right there. So gratitude for everything. I think everybody here can get engaged, whether it is First Mover Coalition, the other types of initiatives. There's so much out there, Leaf Coalition, on and on and on. So many different ways that people are working together. It's exciting. More of it to come.
Absolutely. Well, let's go back to the data, because we heard a lot about AI, we heard a lot about new tech, and digital transformation is obviously a theme here. How does data help? How can we help in practice, and how does the administration and maybe some thoughts you can share at the international level, the government see this hopefully becoming progressively more helpful in this field?
Do you want to start, or shall I? I can jump in briefly. If you are committed to change something, you need to have accountability. To have accountability and transparency, you really do need to have data. Otherwise, you are guessing. And so that's a through line, not surprisingly, for a company like Salesforce. That's what we've done in a lot of other areas. But we turned that bright, shining light on ourselves as part of our goals. It started when we made the determination several years ago that we did want to quickly get to net zero through scope 3. That can't be guesswork. What we found along the way was that we were doing this through manual processes, so that was clunky, it was slow, it was not going to reach our ambitions. And so we developed through our own technology at first, our own version of what's now been called Net Zero Cloud, which was an automated way from the sensors and sources and processes to pull, analyze, visualize your data so you can see where you are and how you can act on it. We pretty quickly realized, well, that's interesting, probably for our customers who we want to help along the way. Because this work, the policy work is important. Obviously, I care about policy, but you got to get your own house in order. And then what can we do as a software company to help our customers who are on that journey? So we created a much more automated, much more easier to use platform so that people can see where they are, where they need to go to. That was one part. Another example that I'd share, also very data-driven, very exciting. You could argue that the software industry is not a hard-to-abate sector, but at the same time, little secret, our energy emissions in total are both growing and are close to the aviation sector in total, about 4% of global emissions. So we have a lot of work to do to be responsible. So Salesforce helped develop and release a whole green codes framework, which is to help technologists to understand how can they code and develop in a more sustainable, energy efficient way with framework. And people want this. I mean, technologists, we've done some polling on this, 75% of technologists want to be more energy efficient. They recognize that they don't have the tools. So doing things like this just to help people along the way. And a final point on data that I'll say, I think relevant for all companies, and this was mentioned earlier on one of the panels on AI, or maybe it was Michelle Flournoy who mentioned this. You do what you're incentivized to do. So part of what Salesforce has done is to tie executive and leadership compensation to reaching, achieving, or surpassing our ESG goals and commitments, including on sustainability. And that's a motivator. And so these are just 3 examples that I've seen to be pretty effective and of interest to a lot of different industries.
Terrific. Let me build on that by hearkening back to something you said earlier, Eric. You said that your business and your business plan requires a planet.
Somewhat.
So too, though, does the planet require a business plan? And I think that's increasingly clear if we're going to get to where we need to go. And you can't have a business plan ultimately without the inputs, without the underlying data architecture that can help drive better decisions, faster decisions, more decentralized decisions. That's frankly a lot of what has enabled many of the gains, much of the progress, much of the action agenda that we've seen over the past couple of years. You can't understand exactly the right way to address the complex issue of preserving the Amazon rainforest or forests in the DRC or in Indonesia if you don't have a good way of taking multiple different interesting different inputs, data inputs, putting them together and getting a really high resolution view of carbon stocks, how carbon stocks are changing, and how different economic incentives in those economies, both at the national level, the regional level, the local level, are influencing those changes in carbon and stocks and activities leading to deforestation or preserving those forests. Similarly, when it comes to something that that I've been working on, this reconciling our trade and climate agendas together. We have a global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum trade that we are working on with the EU, transforming the sort of legacy 232 tariffs that have been in place between the United States and the EU and other countries, and trying to transform them into a new, path-breaking model of a trading architecture and of a trading mechanism arrangement that will privilege lower carbon emission steel and aluminum and deal with the overcapacity that we have seen in steel and aluminum markets to date by going after the most carbon intensive production, which is driving overcapacity in a non-market way. It's hard to do that without having a high resolution view on exactly what the different carbon intensities are of different steel and aluminum production around the world, not only on a facility basis, but actually on an individual product basis. But those are things that we can actually start to solve today using the application of data, machine learning, and business models that many of you are bringing to the table to sort of the trade flows that we see today. Similarly, another one I'll just mention, methane emissions. One of the most powerful greenhouse gas pollutants in the world that actually has, in many cases, a negative cost of addressing it because one person's pollution, in the case of methane, is another person's valuable commodity, especially when gas prices in Europe are hitting record highs as we've seen over the past year. But how do you get that gas, which is currently being flared or vented into the atmosphere in very damaging ways, with the greenhouse gas potential, which is multiples that of CO2, how do you get that and actually bring it to market? It's not so easy. A lot of people don't even know what's going on. In countries like Nigeria, Turkmenistan, Iraq, we see large pockets of high methane emissions activity that we can address by bringing, again, high resolution data from satellite data, sensor data, and then again, smart approaches to try and figure out what's the right way to get that commodity going into the atmosphere, and to a market where a user can actually benefit from it. These are all cases where, in many cases, actually, the software industry, the data industry, acts like another utility for us, almost like our transmission grid, right? You are connecting sources of demand, sources of supply. You're connecting challenges with solution sets and opportunities. And so what we need is, just as we need to build out our grid here in the United States too, we also need to build out that kind of data infrastructure and architecture that can help to better connect those different dots as well.
Couldn't say that better. Staying on the incentives and maybe taking that a bit of an international perspective, especially as we hear the efforts you're doing with the EU, obviously coming from Brussels, I also have that lens, but also be mindful of time. What are the international incentives there? How are you working together? And obviously Salesforce and many BSA members being global partners, how is that working out? And what's your ambitions there?
I'll just mention very quickly, I know time is short, we have an enormous opportunity in terms of building on this momentum in the transatlantic relationship. A lot of ink has been spilled in breathless headlines about some of the angst, temporary angst over the Inflation Reduction Act and what it means for Europe, et cetera. I think we've reached a very positive phase in that sort of reaction set. We moved to a phase where Europe is now looking at how they can make their own complementary investments in their own economies to drive the sort of transformation that's needed, because frankly, we need more government support. We need more alignment between our economies, not less. We need more complementarity, not more friction. And we also have structures like the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. I'm one of the co-chairs of the working group of that TTC, as it's called, that's focused on the clean economy, that's focused on climate and clean energy. We're using that to try and drive greater harmonization where possible and greater cross-transatlantic learning on things like vehicle-to-grid charging. So how do we make sure that there's kind of a common market for and a common approach to vehicle-to-grid charging, using vehicles as mobile batteries on our grids as they need to become increasingly flexible? That's just one example of many of the sorts of things we can drive through the TTC, through a dialogue on clean energy subsidies and others that we'll be making progress on. So I'm actually very excited about where we are in the phase of that conversation post-IRA, and I think that's a real space to watch.
That's great. I'll just mention another concept in the international sphere that we haven't gotten to too much, but worth at least thought, and that is about high quality and integrity carbon marketplaces and where that fits in with the overall equation. Sometimes the concepts of offset, it immediately gets people thinking in a negative way. It just like, look, you're not dealing with the most important problem, which is emissions reduction. And to that I say it's all of the above, because this is a formula, right? Trying to achieve our 1.5 degree target requires both emissions reductions and sequestration of the carbon that is already in the atmosphere. And so there is absolutely a nature positive need here. And when I think about that, of course, it is all about quality and integrity. So many of these opportunities are in international markets. Often they are also in developing markets. And a huge part of the international conversation has also been financing not only of harm and adaptation, but a lot of initiatives that could be high quality are in global south. There is an opportunity. There's technology to help identify where these are. But I just bring that to the fore as well. That's an important part of the discussion that the private sector has, obviously to be very responsible while you work on your emissions reductions and you think about what carbon initiatives you are going to invest in. But that is an important part of the international dialogue as well. And it's come up. It'll come up at COP28 again.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we already ran out of time, but luckily we're followed by another excellent panel, and we're going to have time to talk about this more during the day. So I would just ask you to join me in an applause to thank our panelists and welcome the other one coming up.
Great to see you.
Thank you very much.